I thought the dinner before our wedding was a warm welcome, but sitting by the candlelight, hearing harmless words glide across the table, I realized I was there for a final test. My future in-laws did not know I never look at marriage with dreamy eyes. I make a living finding what people hide in the fine print. By tomorrow morning, the only person who truly knows how this wedding ends is me. My name is Fern Sims. I am 31 years old, born and raised in the modest, hardworking neighborhoods of Dayton, Ohio. For the past several years, I have built a solid career as a contract risk analyst at Holloway Meridian Logistics. My daily life revolves around searching for the hidden liabilities buried deep within 100-page corporate agreements. I am a pragmatic, independent woman. My profession has fundamentally rewired my brain to look at the world through the lens of small, easily missed signs rather than trusting grand, sweeping promises. In my line of work, the truth never announces itself boldly. It whispers from the fine print. The afternoon before my wedding felt like stepping into a beautiful, surreal dream. I was in a luxurious hotel suite in Savannah, Georgia, surrounded by the physical manifestations of my impending marriage. The late afternoon sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor, illuminating the heavy ivory silk of my wedding dress hanging delicately against the wardrobe door. Neatly wrapped gift boxes stacked in the corner, intricately lettered guest name cards scattered across the dining table, and the faint, sweet scent of white roses filled the room. I was sitting on the edge of the plush velvet sofa, taking a quiet moment to absorb the reality that my single life was ending. Everything was perfectly arranged. Then, my phone buzzed against the glass coffee table, breaking the serene silence. It was a message from my fiancé, Beckett Vale. The text simply read, "My mother wants you at dinner tonight." It was a seemingly normal, harmless sentence, yet reading it made me pause. The timing felt too sudden, arriving just a few hours before the evening began. It was too close to the ceremony, thrust into the middle of a chaotic schedule where every hour had been meticulously planned for months. I took a deep breath and quickly rationalized the sudden invitation. I told myself it was just an intimate, family dinner before the wedding day. I assumed it was a polite, welcoming gesture from my future mother-in-law, Celeste Vale. Celeste was a woman of terrifyingly perfect elegance. She was always perfectly poised, always polite, but she had never once made me feel entirely close to her. Her warmth always felt like a beautifully tailored garment that she wore for social occasions. Flawless, but entirely manufactured. Sitting there in the quiet hotel room, a memory from a few weeks prior suddenly surfaced in my mind. Celeste and I had been having afternoon tea in the sunroom of their estate. Amidst the casual chatter about floral arrangements and seating charts, she had asked me, repeatedly and with an intense, laser-like focus, if I still owned the small duplex I had inherited from my grandmother back in Ohio. She wanted to know if the title was clear, if it was unencumbered by any debt. At the time, I simply thought it was the typical, slightly intrusive curiosity often found in wealthy families. I assumed they just wanted to understand the financial reality of the woman marrying into their pristine lineage. In my eyes, Beckett was the ultimate anchor. He was 37 years old, composed, undeniably handsome, and carried himself with the effortless grace of someone raised in high society. He came from a prestigious, historic family background. Because of his polished exterior and deeply reassuring presence, any slight irregularities in his behavior were easily overshadowed. When you look at a man who seems to have walked straight out of a luxury catalog, you tend to ignore the tiny, discordant notes in his melody. Before I could even stand up to find my shoes, another message from Beckett lit up my screen. This one was even stranger. He asked me to remember to bring my passport, my driver license, and a few other important personal documents to the dinner. He wrote that it would make things much easier for the formal name change procedures and our honeymoon check-in tomorrow morning. I stared at the glowing screen, feeling a distinct friction in my mind. It was an odd request. Changing a legal name after a wedding is a notoriously slow bureaucratic process. It requires certified copies of marriage licenses that take weeks to arrive by mail. It is certainly not an urgent matter that needs to be handled the morning after the ceremony. However, I was exhausted. I was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of tasks I had completed that week, and swimming in the emotional vulnerability of a bride on the eve of her wedding. I told my analytical brain to shut down. I temporarily pushed the growing suspicion aside, attributing it to pre-wedding anxiety. About an hour later, I was driving my rental car toward the Vale family estate. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the winding roads of Savannah. Spanish moss hung heavily from the ancient oak trees, swaying gently in the humid evening breeze. As I approached the massive wrought iron gates of the mansion, a very strange, cold sensation settled in the pit of my stomach. The property looked stunning under the twilight sky. The warm, golden light spilling from the tall, arched windows contrasted perfectly with the bruised purple of the approaching night. But as I parked the car and stepped out into the humid air, the atmosphere felt suffocating. Everything was simply too beautiful. It was far too quiet. There was no sound of laughter, no casual movement of a family preparing for a joyous occasion. The absolute stillness of the manicured lawns and the silent, imposing facade of the house made the hair on my arms stand up. It did not feel like a home opening its doors to embrace a new daughter. It felt entirely different. It felt as though the house had been meticulously prepared, not for a warm family dinner, but for a highly calculated, heavily orchestrated stage production. And I was walking right into the center of it. I stepped through the heavy double doors of the estate, and my breath caught instantly. The foyer opened into the formal dining room, revealing a setup that was far too opulent for a casual evening meal. The long mahogany table was bathed in the flickering glow of dozens of tall taper candles. Heavy crystal wine glasses caught the light, casting sharp prisms across the thick linen tablecloth. In the center sat an elaborate arrangement of white orchids and hydrangeas, identical to the floral concept I had approved for the wedding reception. It felt less like a welcoming dinner and more like a meticulously staged rehearsal. Beside Celeste and Beckett stood a man I had never met. He appeared to be in his late 50s, wearing a charcoal suit that was sharply tailored but entirely devoid of warmth. Celeste introduced him with a practiced, radiant smile as Adrian Loft, an old friend of the family. However, the way his eyes tracked my movements as I walked into the room was entirely clinical. He did not look at me the way one looks at a newly arrived bride. He looked at me the way a senior auditor evaluates a high-risk ledger. We sat down to a first course of seared scallops. Initially, the conversation flowed along the expected, safe channels. We discussed the final catering headcount, the arrival schedule for the string quartet, and the weather forecast for our flight to the Amalfi Coast. But within 15 minutes, the tone began to pivot sharply. Adrian leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He did not ask about how Beckett and I had met, or what our favorite shared hobbies were. Instead, he smoothly inserted inquiries about my career trajectory. Then, the questions tightened like a snare. He asked about the exact nature of my employment contract, the current status of my credit history, and, with a casualness that felt incredibly forced, what my long-term financial strategy was for the property I held back in Ohio. Before I could fully process the audacity of a stranger asking about my real estate over dinner, Beckett chuckled. He reached over, placing a warm, seemingly reassuring hand over mine. He told me not to mind Adrian, explaining that the man had spent 3 decades as a wealth management advisor and simply could not turn off his financial brain. The excuse was plausible on the surface. Yet, Beckett delivered the line a fraction of a second too fast. The rhythm was entirely wrong. It lacked the genuine hesitation of someone caught off guard by a friend acting rudely. It felt rehearsed, a pre-written line delivered exactly on cue to smooth over the interrogation. The main course arrived, but my appetite had completely vanished. Celeste took over the conversation, her voice dripping with an almost suffocating maternal affection. She reached for her wine glass, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapping around the delicate crystal stem. She spoke about the sanctity of marriage, but her vocabulary was fundamentally strange. She said that after tomorrow morning, all individual boundaries would dissolve, and everything would belong to the collective whole. She smiled softly, adding that true family means carrying the weight of massive obligations together. She looked directly into my eyes, her gaze heavy and unblinking, stating that sometimes a woman simply has to learn to blindly trust the man leading her household. I nodded, maintaining a pleasant, frozen smile, but my mind was racing frantically. As the plates were being cleared by the silent serving staff, I caught fragments of hushed exchanges between Beckett and his mother. When they thought I was distracted by the sommelier pouring more wine, their conversational tone shifted entirely. The soft, familial warmth evaporated, replaced by clipped, highly efficient phrases. I heard Beckett murmur something about a specific time frame being tight. Celeste nodded once, her expression rigid, replying that the signatures absolutely had to be secured and processed before 12 o'clock noon. These were not words of love or wedding day logistics. This was the sterile, rigid vocabulary of an impending corporate transaction. 10 years of dissecting risk clauses and vendor agreements had trained my ear to detect administrative mandates masquerading as casual dialogue. I knew the cadence of a trap being set. Sitting there, sipping a vintage red wine, the reality washed over me with a freezing clarity. I was not a guest of honor at a family gathering. I was a candidate sitting through a final compliance review. They were assessing my pliability, testing to see if I would ask questions or simply nod and sign wherever they pointed. As dessert was served, Celeste stood up to propose a toast. She raised her glass high, the candlelight reflecting brilliantly off the expensive diamond on her hand. She did not drink to love, or passion, or a lifetime of happiness. Instead, her voice rang out clear and authoritative in the quiet room. She drank to ultimate stability. She drank to a protected future, to securing the legacy, and to making the absolute correct decision at the precise required moment. I raised my own glass, letting the rim touch my lips, but my throat felt completely closed. The wine tasted like ash. I kept the smile plastered on my face, but underneath the heavy tablecloth, my hands were curled into tight, shaking fists. The evening finally began to wind down. As we stood up to move toward the parlor for coffee, I intentionally dropped my silk napkin, using the momentary distraction to crouch down. My eyes swept the floor and stopped dead at a small mahogany side table tucked into the shadows near the dining room entrance. Stuffed on the bottom shelf was a thick, leather-bound portfolio. Embossed in gold lettering across the front was the Vale family crest. Peeking out from the crisp edges of the heavy parchment paper inside were several bright yellow adhesive tabs. I recognized those tabs instantly. They were the universal, unspoken language of legal teams, placed precisely where a signatory needed to initial and date. It was a perfectly prepared closing packet, lying in wait. And it had absolutely nothing to do with reciting vows at an altar. The air in the formal dining room hung heavy with the cloying scent of melted wax and the lingering sweetness of the raspberry tart dessert. I sat quietly, maintaining a pleasant facade, though I barely tasted a single bite of the intricate pastry. Across the table, Beckett's phone vibrated sharply against the polished wood. He glanced down at the illuminated screen, his jaw tightening just a microscopic fraction. He offered a smooth, practiced apology to the table, citing a minor emergency with one of the wedding vendors, and stood up. He walked out onto the expansive stone terrace, sliding the heavy glass door completely shut behind him to cut off the humid night air. Celeste gracefully rose from her chair at the head of the table. She began gathering a few of the delicate crystal dessert plates, stacking them with precise movements. She turned to me, her lips curved into a smile that felt painted onto her face. Her eyes remained completely flat. She asked if I would be a dear and help her carry the remaining silver serving trays into the large kitchen at the back of the house. She mentioned that she had sent the catering staff home early to ensure they were fully rested for the massive event tomorrow. On the surface, it was a perfectly constructed, intimate gesture. It looked exactly like a mother seamlessly incorporating her new daughter into the quiet, domestic rhythms of the household. However, The reality of the request effectively separated me from the main entertaining spaces. It sent me walking alone down the long, deeply shadowed corridor of the private family wing, while she supposedly went to the parlor to offer Adrian a digestive. I picked up a heavy silver tray laden with unused crystal glassware. The metal felt remarkably cold against the palms of my hands. I turned and began walking down the long hallway. The floorboards were entirely muffled by thick, incredibly expensive runner rugs that absorbed every sound. The silence of the house was absolute and suffocating. I passed a series of closed mahogany doors, each one hiding different corners of the family history. Then, my eyes caught a break in the pattern. One door on the left side of the corridor was not fully shut. A narrow slice of warm, amber light spilled out through the crack and stretched across the dark hallway floor. I knew this room. It was Celeste's private study, the nerve center where she managed the massive estate. I stopped walking. My breathing naturally slowed down, a physical reaction born from years of meticulously analyzing corporate discrepancies. I looked through the narrow gap. The room was lined from floor to ceiling with dark wood bookshelves. In the exact center of the room sat a massive antique desk. And right there, resting directly under the focused glow of a brass reading lamp, was the thick leather portfolio. It was the exact same portfolio I had spotted hidden on the bottom shelf of the side table just an hour ago. The gold-embossed family crest practically glowed under the light. Every rational, polite instinct in my body told me to keep walking toward the kitchen. Good guests do not snoop through private offices. Brides certainly do not spy on the financial desks of their future mothers. But my brain was not wired to ignore glaring anomalies. I was a professional risk analyst. I spent 40 hours a week hunting for the lethal trapdoors hidden deeply within plain sight. The warning bells ringing inside my head were absolutely deafening. I carefully set the heavy silver tray down on a nearby hall console table. The metal barely made a whisper against the polished wood. I reached out and pushed the heavy oak door open. It swung silently on perfectly oiled hinges. I stepped into the study. The air inside the room smelled distinctly of aged paper, expensive leather, and a faint hint of citrus polish. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, echoing in my ears. But my hands remained completely steady. I walked straight to the center of the desk. I did not allow myself a single moment of hesitation. I reached out and flipped open the heavy, rigid cover of the leather portfolio. A cascade of dense, freshly printed legal documents lay waiting inside. The pages were pristine and terrifyingly crisp. Every single crucial line and signature block was flagged with bright yellow sticky tabs. I knew exactly what those markers meant. They were the kind of tabs that tell a cooperating signatory exactly where to surrender their personal rights without reading the fine print. I looked at the top document. The title was printed in bold, uncompromising black ink across the top margin. It read, "Spousal Consent and Personal Guarantee." My stomach dropped violently, plunging into a deep, freezing void of realization. I quickly flipped the heavy pages to reach the second major packet. It was a massive commercial lending agreement. The structure outlined a high-interest bridge loan. The primary borrower was listed officially as Vale Harvest Hospitality. I scanned the dense, single-spaced paragraphs, my eyes automatically hunting for the critical financial data points. The spelled-out numbers painted a truly horrifying picture. The family company was heavily bleeding cash. A catastrophic balloon payment of $12 million was contractually due in exactly 48 hours. They were facing imminent, devastating default. They desperately needed a massive, immediate injection of liquidity to save their crumbling hospitality empire from absolute ruin. My fingers trembled slightly as I turned to the third document. My breath hitched sharply in my throat. It was a detailed schedule of collateral assets. Right there, typed perfectly onto the stark white page, was the precise legal description of a residential property. It listed lot number 7, block 4, of the Dayton Residential Registry. It was the exact street address of the small duplex my grandmother had left to me. It was the only tangible piece of the world that truly belonged to me. earned through decades of my family working factory shifts. The document proudly listed the property as a clean, entirely unencumbered asset. Directly below the property description was a summary profile of the required guarantor. It clearly listed my full name. Next to my name was my exact credit score, a number hovering securely near 800. They had pulled my private financial history. They had audited my entire life behind my back. I dragged my eyes down to the final signature line at the very bottom of the page. My name was already typed out in formal letters, but it did not say Fern Sims. It said Fern Vale. They had already changed my legal identity on paper. The signature line was empty, waiting patiently for my pen. The date line was completely blank, waiting for tomorrow afternoon. It was waiting for the ink to dry on our ceremonial marriage certificate. They did not want to welcome a daughter into their home. They wanted a human financial shield. They needed my spotless credit record and my debt-free property to act as the sacrificial collateral for their toxic, sprawling liabilities. Panic briefly threatened to blur my vision, but a wave of cold, hard anger violently slammed it down. I reached deep into the pocket of my dress and pulled out my phone. I swiftly navigated to the settings and silenced the device completely, ensuring no shutter sound would betray me. I opened the camera application. I photographed the title page. I captured the punishing loan terms. I recorded the collateral schedule detailing my grandmother's home. My hands moved with swift, mechanical precision. I flipped rapidly through the remaining pages until I found a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored stationery tucked near the very back of the folder. It prominently bore the letterhead of Edwin Crowley, attorney at law. It was a highly confidential legal memorandum addressed directly to Celeste and Beckett. I zoomed in tightly on the central paragraph. The words constructed a masterpiece of legal sociopathy. Crowley explicitly advised the Vale family to present the signature pages to me immediately following the conclusion of the wedding ceremony. He wrote that the extreme emotional high of the wedding day, combined seamlessly with the physical presence of high-profile guests and local media, would create an environment of intense psychological pressure. He clinically noted that a bride standing in her white gown, completely surrounded by celebrating family members and flashing cameras, would be highly unlikely to challenge a supposedly mundane request for administrative signatures. He literally called the strategy a method for mitigating the risk of emotional resistance. I photographed the terrible memo twice to ensure the text was perfectly legible. Suddenly, a sharp sound shattered the quiet focus of the room. Footsteps. The rapid rhythmic clicking of low heels striking the hardwood floor of the main hallway. I froze instantly. The footsteps stopped just a few yards away. A voice echoed down the corridor. It was Celeste. She was speaking on her mobile phone, and her tone was entirely stripped of all the honeyed, maternal warmth she had used at the dining table just minutes ago. Her voice was sharp, commanding, and thoroughly exhausted. I heard her speak clearly into the receiver. She told the person on the other end of the line to stop panicking immediately. She stated, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that once tomorrow is done, everything is secured. She firmly promised that the massive capital injection would be fully released by Monday morning. The cruel words hung heavily in the air. This was no longer just a paranoid theory built from strange glances and odd questions. It was a confirmed, actively executing strategy. The entire beautiful, lavish wedding was nothing more than an elaborate closing dinner for a corporate transaction. I slipped my phone back into my hidden pocket. I carefully and quickly realigned the heavy pages of the portfolio, ensuring the crisp edges were perfectly flush. I gently smoothed down the leather cover, making absolutely sure it sat exactly where I had found it, directly under the beam of the brass lamp. I stepped backward out of the study. I pulled the heavy oak door closed, meticulously leaving the exact same narrow gap of light spilling out onto the floorboards. I picked up the heavy silver tray from the console table. My reflection briefly caught in the polished surface of a nearby antique mirror. I looked exactly the same on the outside. My hair was perfectly styled. My makeup remained flawless. But the woman staring back at me from the glass was completely different. I walked the rest of the way into the kitchen. I set the tray down forcefully onto the massive marble counter. I turned the brass faucet and let the cold water flow over my hands to steady myself. I stared blankly through the large window at the gardens swallowed by darkness. The soft, somewhat naive bride who had driven up the winding driveway 2 hours ago was completely dead. She had effectively suffocated under a pile of heavily drafted commercial loan documents. In her place stood a woman who knew exactly how to systematically dismantle a fraudulent contract. I dried my hands slowly on a linen towel. I arranged my facial features into a perfect mask of placid, polite contentment. I walked back down the hallway toward the dining room. I was fully ready to play my assigned part. I was ready to smile warmly at the man who was actively planning to ruin my life. I was no longer preparing for a wedding celebration. I was actively gathering ammunition for an execution. The drive back to the hotel was a blur of streetlights and shadows. I walked into my suite, turned the deadbolt, and fastened the heavy brass chain guard. I carefully peeled off my elegant silk dinner dress, letting it fall carelessly onto the velvet armchair. I pulled on a worn gray college sweatshirt, opened my laptop on the glass desk, and seamlessly transferred the high-resolution photographs from my phone to the encrypted hard drive. I was no longer a bride anxiously preparing for a honeymoon flight. I was a senior contract risk analyst clocking into a graveyard shift. I began to zoom in on the captured images, dissecting every paragraph of the legalese. Beckett had casually brushed these documents off as simple administrative forms required for a routine post-wedding name change. That was a spectacular, calculated lie. This was an intricate, highly aggressive legal web entirely designed to bind my pristine financial identity to their rapidly sinking ship, the absolute moment the officiant pronounced us husband and wife. I picked up my phone and dialed the only person I trusted implicitly to help me navigate a complex, bureaucratic labyrinth in the middle of the night. Tessa Greer was my oldest, closest friend and a senior compliance clerk at the county public records office back home. She was the brilliant, relentless woman who had successfully navigated the chaotic maze of zoning laws, tax assessments, and building permits when I took over my grandmother property in Ohio. The clock on my laptop read 11:45 in the evening, but when Tessa answered, she heard the absolute dead calm in my voice. I told her I needed her to run a deep, comprehensive corporate background check immediately. She did not ask for a single explanation or complain about the late hour. I heard the rapid clatter of her keyboard as she booted up her remote access terminal. For the next 3 hours, Tessa and I sat on an open line, operating like a forensic accounting strike team. We began tracing a sprawling, toxic ecosystem of limited liability companies, offshore holding groups, and domestic partnerships directly tied to Beckett and his mother. Tessa utilized her advanced access to public tax registries, state corporate databases, and municipal property records to systematically pull back the velvet curtain the Vale family had erected. The financial picture that emerged on my screen was utterly devastating. Beckett was not simply a wealthy, carefree heir to a historic Southern hospitality empire. He was the listed director of a dozen actively bleeding corporate entities. There was a boutique restaurant group operating at a massive loss, a luxury event management firm buried under vendor disputes, and even a historic family preservation fund that appeared to be severely mismanaged. They were all deeply cross-collateralized. The family had stacked these entities on top of each other, creating an incredibly fragile tower of debt where one defaulted loan would trigger a catastrophic domino effect across their entire portfolio. The revelations grew exponentially worse with every new search query Tessa executed. We discovered that the magnificent Savannah estate, where we were supposed to host hundreds of guests tomorrow, was mortgaged to the absolute hilt. The flagship restaurant brand was actively fighting off multiple liens from unpaid food suppliers and contractors. Even a significant, supposedly untouchable portion of their charitable family trust had been quietly leveraged and was currently standing on the absolute brink of foreclosure. They were drowning in tens of millions of dollars of toxic liabilities. Then, Tessa pulled up the active commercial lending schedules attached to the main holding company. My blood ran completely cold. The massive refinancing package, the exact one requiring my signature as a primary personal guarantor, was strictly hard-coded with an execution date set for the exact day of our wedding. This lavish ceremony, the expensive string quartet, the imported white orchids, the meticulously planned reception for 300 guests, it was not a celebration of romantic commitment. It was a carefully timed, heavily staged financial trigger. The official marriage certificate was the final mandatory puzzle piece required to activate a desperate corporate bailout. I opened the terrifying image of the confidential email from their family lawyer. Edwin Crowley. I read his precise words out loud to Tessa. He had explicitly written that the strong professional reputation and the completely unblemished, dispute-free credit profile of the bride would ensure the high-risk refinancing application passed through the strict underwriting committee smoothly. He noted that my stable income history and debt-free real estate asset would provide the necessary leverage to secure the $12 million bridge loan. I was not a partner to them. I was never a beloved future daughter-in-law. I was simply a premium credit score wrapped tightly in white lace. Sitting in the dim blue light of the hotel room screen, the past 24 months of my life began to reassemble themselves into a horrifying, sickening new pattern. Every single confusing memory suddenly made perfect sense. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a cruel, undeniable logic. I clearly remembered how casually, almost playfully, Beckett would ask highly specific questions about the annual tax assessments and the foundational structure of my inherited property in Ohio. I recalled how Celeste constantly praised my highly practical nature and my stable, independent career trajectory, using those exact clinical words like she was reviewing a promising job applicant rather than speaking to her future family member. The entire Vale family had always treated me with a strange, immediate acceptance from the very first day we met. I had foolishly thought it was because they genuinely saw the love Beckett and I shared. Now I realized it was entirely because my initial financial background check had already cleared their internal underwriting standards. They had systematically pre-selected me based on my utility. It was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. A normal bride, discovering this magnitude of deception on the eve of her wedding, would have collapsed onto the hotel floor in hysterics. She would have called her fiancé in a blind panic, screaming and demanding an immediate explanation, or she would have hastily packed her suitcases and fled into the night on the first available flight out of Georgia. But I did not shed a single tear. My chest ached with a deep, hollow, and incredibly dark betrayal, but my mind was operating with a terrifying, absolute clarity. If I confronted Beckett now, in the middle of the night, they would instantly seize control of the narrative. Celeste would ruthlessly deploy her decades of high society crisis management skills. They would smoothly tell our important guests, their wealthy investors, and the local media that the overwhelming pressure of a high-profile wedding had simply broken me. They would effortlessly spin a deeply sympathetic tale about a fragile, overwhelmed woman from a working-class town in Ohio who suffered a severe nervous breakdown and ran away from the altar, leaving their noble, loving son completely heartbroken. They would systematically destroy my personal and professional reputation while keeping their own pristine, fraudulent facade completely intact. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of a clean escape. I chose a much darker, much more calculated path. I slowly closed my laptop, the sudden darkness reflecting my cold, set expression. I was going to let them fully believe their elaborate trap was working perfectly. I was going to put on that beautiful white dress. I was going to hold my bouquet, and I was going to walk gracefully down that long aisle, but I was absolutely not going to be their silent financial sacrifice. I was going to completely rewrite the ending of their meticulous corporate merger, and I was going to ensure that when the structure collapsed, they would be the only ones buried underneath the rubble. Tessa and I were deep into the 3rd hour of our digital excavation when she suddenly stopped typing. Through the phone speaker, I heard a sharp intake of breath. She told me she had shifted her search parameters away from the corporate shell companies and started pulling public event permits and canceled municipal venue filings from the past 2 years. She found something buried in the county archives from about 14 months ago. It was a partially processed application for a marriage license and a revoked high-capacity event permit for the local botanical gardens. The groom listed on the document was Beckett. The bride was a woman named Mallory Quinn. A canceled engagement is not inherently criminal. People fall out of love, get cold feet, and walk away from relationships every single day. But standing in the wreckage of the Vale family financial crisis, my risk assessment instincts screamed that this was not a harmless, private tragedy. It was a failed beta test. I immediately scoured the internet, cross-referencing social media platforms, alumni directories, and professional networking sites. It took me 20 minutes to locate a current digital marketing profile that matched her name and background. I bypassed the professional inquiries and found a direct mobile number listed for urgent client contacts. I stared at the flashing cursor on my messaging app for a long moment. I needed to cut through any defensive social barriers instantly. I typed a single, highly specific sentence. I wrote, "I think I'm about to step into what you escaped." I hit send and watched the message status change to delivered. The silence that followed was agonizing. 1 hour passed, then 2. The digital clock on the hotel nightstand shifted to 4 in the morning. I was just beginning to think she had blocked the unknown number when my phone screen abruptly lit up with an incoming video call. I accepted the connection. The woman on the screen appeared to be sitting in a dimly lit living room, wrapped in a heavy wool cardigan. Mallory Quinn had a face that projected an innate, grounded intelligence. Her features were remarkably calm, but her eyes held a distinct, lingering exhaustion. It was the look of a survivor who still occasionally checked the locks on her doors. She did not offer a polite greeting. She simply looked at the white silk robe hanging in my background and asked if the wedding was scheduled for tomorrow. When I nodded, she let out a hollow, bitter sigh. For the next 45 minutes, Mallory outlined a psychological blueprint that mirrored my own life with terrifying precision. She told me about her 2-year relationship with Beckett. She described how she had been swept into the Vale family orbit, overwhelmed by how quickly and intensely Celeste had embraced her. She repeated the exact phrases my future mother-in-law had used on me. Celeste had constantly praised Mallory for being so beautifully grounded, for possessing clean, uncomplicated personal assets, and for being a stabilizing force. Then, Mallory described the night before her own scheduled wedding. She spoke of an intimate, candlelit dinner. She recalled the heavy, suffocating conversations about carrying the family legacy, about merging lives, and about how a strong woman must be willing to shoulder burdens alongside her husband. She described the exact moment a leather portfolio was casually pushed across a mahogany table. They had told her it was simply a final, administrative formality to merge their future trusts. But Mallory had a background in commercial real estate. She had read the paperwork. When she realized they were trying to attach her personal collateral to their sinking corporate debt, she refused to pick up the pen. Her voice grew incredibly quiet as she explained the immediate fallout. The Vale family did not argue or threaten her. They executed a masterclass in social assassination. By the time the sun came up the next morning, Celeste had already contacted every mutual friend, extended family member, and local vendor. The Vales spun a flawless, deeply sympathetic narrative. They claimed Mallory had suffered a severe panic attack, that she was terrified of true commitment, and that she had lost total control of her mental faculties under the pressure of joining a prominent family. They made her look completely unstable. They played the role of the heartbroken, supportive family so perfectly that even some of Mallory's own friends believed she had simply lost her mind and abandoned a wonderful man at the altar. She paused, reached off screen, and typed something on her keyboard. A moment later, my email inbox chimed. Mallory told me she had kept one piece of digital evidence from the fallout, a mistakenly forwarded message from their attorney, Edwin Crowley. I opened the attachment. It was an internal correspondence dated a few weeks after Mallory had fled. Crowley was outlining the parameters for finding a new candidate to help secure their next round of refinancing. I read the sentence out loud, my voice devoid of any warmth. Crowley stated clearly that Beckett needs a spouse who photographs well, reads as stable, and will not challenge structure under emotional pressure. That single sentence was the heaviest blow of the entire night. It hit deeper than the secret debt, deeper than the fraudulent documents. It was the devastating realization that my entire romance was a calculated recruitment process. I was not chosen because of the way I laughed, or how I looked at Beckett, or the shared dreams we had whispered to each other in the dark. I was selected because my socioeconomic profile fit the exact requirements of a desperate loan underwriter: my steady job, my lack of complicated family drama, and my spotless credit history were not virtues to them. They were simply the right qualifications for a job opening I never knew I applied for. I sat in silence, letting the cold reality freeze over the last remaining embers of my broken heart. But before she ended the call, Mallory offered one final, crucial piece of perspective that shattered the simple narrative of a villain and his victim. She looked directly into the camera and told me that the most dangerous thing about Beckett is that he is not a sociopath. She said he genuinely loved her, and she firmly believed he genuinely loved me. When it was just the two of them, away from the suffocating pressure of his mother and the crumbling estate, he was kind, attentive, and deeply affectionate. But love, Mallory explained, is not a substitute for a spine. Whenever Beckett was forced to choose between facing the terrifying reality of his family financial ruin and lying to the woman he loved, he always chose the path of least resistance. He was paralyzed by his mother, terrified of losing his inherited status, and too weak to dismantle the toxic legacy he was born into. He convinced himself that manipulating his bride was a necessary sacrifice to save the family. Mallory's words echoed in my mind long after the screen went black. Beckett was not a criminal mastermind rubbing his hands together in the shadows. He was simply a coward. He was a man who learned how to disguise his betrayal as a plea for partnership. That made him far less intimidating, but it did not make him innocent. A grown man making the active choice to serve you to the wolves because he is too afraid to fight them himself is still holding the knife, and I fully intended to make him drop it. The digital clock glowing on the nightstand shifted to 5 in the morning. I stared at the ceiling, my mind running through the evidence I had meticulously compiled. I had the photographs of the oppressive loan documents. I had the horrifying email from the family attorney. I had the harrowing testimony of the woman who came before me. But as a seasoned risk analyst, I knew exactly how corporate defense strategies operated. Paperwork could easily be dismissed as early drafts. Emails could be written off as aggressive contingency plans. Even Mallory could be painted as a bitter woman trying to sabotage my big day out of pure jealousy. If I truly wanted to paralyze the Vale family and prevent them from twisting the narrative, I needed undeniable, living proof that this was a premeditated trap and not a tragic administrative misunderstanding. My phone vibrated sharply against the glass desk. The sudden sound made my pulse jump. It was an anonymous text message from an unknown number. The message simply instructed me to step out into the hotel hallway immediately, promising that I would find the final piece of the puzzle waiting for me. I pulled my robe tighter around my waist and slowly opened the heavy wooden door of my suite. The long corridor was completely deserted and dimly lit by elegant wall sconces. Standing a few yards away, clutching a thin trench coat over her silk pajamas, was Nora Vale. Beckett had a younger sister. Throughout the entire agonizing year of wedding preparations, Nora had been little more than a ghost. She attended the mandatory bridal showers and the endless dress fittings, but she always stood in the background, nursing a glass of champagne and offering nothing more than polite, tight-lipped smiles. I had always assumed she was simply aloof or painfully shy. I stepped aside and gestured for her to enter the room. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind us, the fragile, polite facade she always wore completely crumbled. Nora did not waste time with apologies or tearful introductions. She stood in the center of the room, her voice shaking with years of deeply suppressed rage. She told me she could no longer stomach watching her mother turn the sacred act of marriage into a blunt instrument to save their rotting reputation. She refused to be a silent accomplice to a scheme designed to rescue a fake legacy built entirely on deception. She reached deep into her coat pocket and pulled out her mobile phone. She swiped across the glowing screen and held the device out to me. It was an old audio recording she had secretly intercepted from their shared family cloud account months ago. I pressed the play button. The audio was slightly muffled, but the voice was unmistakably Celeste. It completely lacked the sugary, maternal warmth she always weaponized in public. It was the sharp, commanding tone of a ruthless executive issuing orders to a failing subordinate. Celeste spoke directly to Beckett. She told her son that he did not need a beautiful romance. She stated with absolute, terrifying clarity that he needed to marry the exact right kind of woman who possessed the financial stability to keep their house standing. The recording clicked off. The resulting silence in the hotel room felt absolutely suffocating. Nora wrapped her arms tightly around herself, staring blankly at the floor. She began to systematically dismantle the myth of the Vale dynasty. She revealed that when their father died a decade ago, he did not leave behind a vast, untouchable fortune. He left behind a terrifying labyrinth of hidden, high-interest commercial loans. From the exact moment the reading of the will concluded, Celeste had been living in a state of absolute, paranoid obsession. She was utterly determined to maintain the grand illusion of their immense wealth at all costs. She began using her own son as a prime financial asset, treating him like a tool to aggressively restructure their crumbling lives. Nora looked up at me, her eyes filled with a complicated, tragic sorrow. She explained that I needed to understand something crucial about the man I was supposed to marry in just a few hours. In her eyes, Beckett was not a malicious monster who enjoyed hurting women. He was a man who had been raised in a suffocating, toxic environment where familial affection was permanently shackled to financial duty. From the time he was a little boy, he was taught that absolute loyalty meant protecting the family name, no matter the personal cost. He eventually learned to justify his terrible manipulation. He learned how to look in the mirror and call his cowardly deceit a noble sacrifice. Hearing those words felt like taking a massive physical blow directly to the chest. A sharp, burning ache spread rapidly behind my ribs. My mind instantly flooded with memories of the quiet, tender moments Beckett and I had shared. I remembered the nights we spent cooking dinner in my small apartment, laughing over burnt toast, when he seemed so profoundly relieved to be away from the stifling pressure of his mother. I had genuinely believed those beautiful moments proved he was fundamentally different from the rest of his calculating family. But standing in the cold hotel room, the devastating truth finally settled deep into my bones. Beckett was not different from them. He was simply much more sophisticated. He used his gentle nature as a brilliant camouflage, drawing me in close enough to ensure the trap would snap shut perfectly without me ever noticing the steel teeth. I took a very deep breath, violently pushing the emotional agony down into a tight, locked box in my mind. I looked at Nora and asked her why she chose tonight, just hours before the ceremony, to finally speak up. She wiped a stray tear from her cheek and delivered the final, explosive piece of intelligence. The grand reception scheduled for tomorrow evening was not just a lavish party for our friends and relatives. Celeste had secretly orchestrated the seating chart to include the senior vice president of their primary lending bank, alongside several major donors to the Vale Family Charitable Fund. The entire wedding was designed to be a highly calculated theatrical stage. Celeste planned to use the celebration to publicly announce the new stability of the Vale enterprise, effectively parading me around the ballroom as their freshly acquired collateral to reassure their nervous investors. A freezing hard clarity washed over me, crystallizing my scattered thoughts into a singular, razor-sharp focus. If I simply packed my bags and slipped out the back door of the hotel right now, they would maintain total control of the damage. They would spin a flawless story about a runaway bride, quietly extend their loan deadlines, and eventually hunt down another unsuspecting woman with a clean credit score to take my place. I looked at Nora and thanked her quietly. As she slipped out of my room and disappeared down the long hall, I walked over to the closet and gently touched the soft silk of my wedding dress. I decided right then that I was absolutely not going to run away. I was not going to cancel the wedding in silence and let them preserve their precious reputation. I was going to give Celeste and Beckett the exact theatrical production they had so meticulously planned. But I was going to completely rewrite the final act. I was going to drag the ugly, undeniable truth out into the blinding light, and I was going to drop it right in the middle of the very stage they intended to use to hide it. By the time the first pale hints of morning began to bleed through the heavy hotel curtains, my transition was complete. I was no longer a woman mourning the sudden death of her future. I was an analyst executing a hostile countermeasure. I opened my encrypted email client and drafted a highly confidential message to Della March. Della was a ruthless, brilliant attorney specializing in complex asset fraud. Someone a former colleague had once recommended when a corporate acquisition went entirely sideways. I securely transmitted every single piece of evidence I had gathered during the long, agonizing night. I attached the high-resolution photographs of the bridge loan documents, the damning legal memorandum from the family lawyer, and the audio file I had just received. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. Della had already reviewed the files over her morning coffee. Her voice was sharp, professional, and completely devoid of pity, which was exactly what I needed. She confirmed my initial assessment with absolute certainty. She explained that without my physical witness signature on those specific lines, their entire corporate restructuring effort would completely collapse. The bank would never release the funds. However, Della issued a stark, terrifying warning. The primary danger was not that they would attempt to forge my signature. The real threat was psychological coercion. She explained that their strategy relied entirely on utilizing the chaotic, overwhelming, and emotionally charged environment of a massive wedding reception to fundamentally disorient me. They intended to thrust a pen into my hand while I was surrounded by hundreds of cheering guests, blinding camera flashes, and the intoxicating illusion of a perfect day, counting on the fact that I would be too vulnerable to read the fine print. I merged Tessa and Mallory onto a secure conference call. The three of us operated like a seasoned crisis management team, establishing a strict, unbreakable pact of silence. We all agreed that if we confronted Beckett or Celeste prematurely, or if we caused a dramatic scene in the hotel lobby right now, we would instantly hand them the strategic advantage. If they were alerted early, they would immediately activate their extensive social defenses. They would shred the physical documents, wipe their digital servers, and systematically rebrand me as a hysterical, unstable woman buckling under the immense pressure of joining a prominent family. I would become the crazy runaway bride, and they would remain the tragic, dignified victims. To secure my ultimate victory, I had to willingly step back into the trap. I forced myself to play the role of the blushing, beautifully oblivious bride. It required a level of physical and emotional control I did not know I possessed. I picked up my phone and began responding to Beckett with nauseating sweetness. I took 3 different pictures of myself trying on various shades of pink lipstick, asking for his opinion on which one looked best for the ceremony. I enthusiastically confirmed the arrival times for the groomsmen and the photographer, typing out words of affection while my actual heart felt like a frozen stone inside my chest. Later that morning, before the chaotic machinery of the wedding day fully roared to life, there was a soft, familiar knock on my door. I unlocked it to find Beckett standing in the hallway. He looked devastatingly handsome in his casual clothes, his hair slightly tousled. He stepped into the suite, wrapping his strong arms around me and pulling me tightly against his chest. He buried his face in my neck and whispered a sentence that was composed of exactly half truth and half absolute poison. He said that by tomorrow, all of the intense pressure would finally vanish, and we would become a real family. I pulled back just enough to look directly into his striking eyes. In that quiet, suspended moment, I finally understood the true, terrifying nature of his danger. Beckett did not scream. He did not throw punches, and he did not issue overt, aggressive threats. His ultimate, most lethal weapon was his profound softness. He possessed the horrifying ability to make a calculated, devastating financial betrayal sound exactly like a desperate, romantic plea for my sympathy. He used his vulnerability as a blade. I decided to test the waters, pushing the boundary just a fraction of an inch to see his reaction. I offered him a sweet, naive smile, and casually asked about those administrative papers his mother had mentioned preparing for us to sign after the ceremony. I felt his body instantly go rigid against mine. The subtle shift in his posture was entirely unmistakable. He hesitated for 2 agonizing seconds, his eyes darting away for a microsecond before he smoothly dodged the inquiry. He offered a charming, dismissive laugh and gently kissed my forehead. He told me not to worry my pretty head about boring legal logistics on the most important day of our lives. He promised we would handle all the tedious paperwork later, together. That single, evasive smile was his absolute, final confession. He knew exactly what that leather portfolio contained. He knew exactly what his mother was planning, and he was fully prepared to walk me straight to the slaughterhouse with a loving smile on his face. After he left the room to go join his groomsmen, the silence of the suite rushed back in. I walked slowly over to the neatly made king-sized bed. I slid the heavy diamond engagement ring off my finger and placed it gently on the pristine white duvet. Next to the ring, I laid down the thick stack of printed financial dossiers Tessa and I had compiled. Finally, I placed my mobile phone, containing the damning audio recordings and my coordinated communications with Della and Mallory, right beside the documents. I stood there for a long time, staring down at the 3 objects resting on the mattress. They were the physical artifacts of one cohesive, profoundly tragic story. The sparkling diamond represented the beautiful, manufactured illusion of our love. The dense legal paperwork represented the cold, mechanical reality of their trap, and the digital device held the undeniable, explosive truth. I took a deep, steadying breath. Filling my lungs with cold resolve, I made a silent, unbreakable vow to myself in that empty room. My revenge would not be a messy, emotional spectacle. There would be no hysterical screaming, no throwing crystal vases against the wall, and absolutely no crying on the floor. I was going to force every single member of the Vale family to consume their own toxic medicine. I would use their own native language against them. I would take their fraudulent contracts, their hidden evidence, and their precious, fragile social reputation, and I would make those very things turn around and bite them. I was going to let them build their magnificent stage, and then I was going to burn it to the ground while they were standing right in the center of it. The morning sun rose over the historic Savannah estate, casting a warm golden glow over the immaculate grounds. From the second-story window of the bridal suite, I looked down at the sprawling back lawn. The venue was absolutely breathtaking. It was a masterpiece of manufactured perfection. Thousands of white roses and orchids cascaded from towering floral arches. A small army of staff members quietly lit hundreds of tall taper candles inside hurricane glass along the stone pathways. The faint, elegant sound of a string quartet tuning their instruments drifted up through the humid morning air. Black luxury sedans were already pulling up to the valet stand, discharging wealthy guests dressed in custom tailoring and designer silk. This magnificent display was the exact facade my future mother-in-law lived her entire life to protect. It was a beautiful, hollow shell. Inside the bridal suite, the atmosphere was thick with hairspray, expensive perfume, and an underlying electric tension. The makeup artist was gently dabbing a soft peach tint onto my cheekbones when the heavy wooden door swung open. Celeste stepped into the room. She looked flawless in a pale silver gown, exuding an aura of serene maternal joy. She was not alone. Trailing closely behind her was a middle-aged woman wearing a stiff, unremarkable charcoal suit. Celeste glided across the room, beaming radiantly. She placed a gentle, perfectly manicured hand on my shoulder. She introduced the stranger as a dedicated travel document coordinator, whom the family had hired to ensure our complicated international honeymoon flights and immediate marital updates went smoothly. I offered a polite, nervous smile, but my eyes immediately dropped to the heavy leather tote bag the woman was carrying. Through the slightly unzipped top, I clearly saw the unmistakable thick wooden handle and heavy brass base of an official notary public seal. Beside it rested a leather-bound chronological logbook, the strict legal requirement for recording sworn signatures. She was not here to coordinate travel itineraries. She was a state-commissioned official brought in to legally bind my financial execution. Celeste gestured for the woman to approach. The notary pulled a familiar, thick stack of papers from her bag and laid them out across the glass vanity table right next to my hairpins. Celeste spoke in a voice that was smooth, soothing, and utterly toxic. She casually explained that these were just standard, boring administrative forms. She claimed they were simply name change confirmations, a routine liability waiver for the event insurance, and a flight proxy authorization so they could upgrade our airline seats while we were busy celebrating. I looked down at the documents. They had placed a fresh cover sheet on top, but the moment I reached out and flipped the first page, the illusion shattered. Beneath the fake cover letter lay the exact same high-interest commercial bridge loan agreement and the binding spousal personal guarantee I had photographed in the dark study. The margins were lined with the identical bright yellow sticky notes, marking the precise locations where my signature was demanded. My printed name sat waiting at the bottom of every single critical page, ready to sign away the home my grandmother built and the financial independence I had worked my entire adult life to secure. Celeste leaned in closer. Her perfume smelled like crushed lilies and cold calculation. She softly urged me to just quickly initial the marked pages now. She reasoned that taking care of this tiny chore before the ceremony would save us so much annoying paperwork after we returned from our romantic honeymoon. Right at that exact moment, my phone vibrated sharply against the vanity mirror. It was a text message from Beckett. The message popped up on the illuminated screen. He wrote that I looked incredibly beautiful this morning, but added a rushed, frantic second sentence. He urged me to please sign the forms his mother brought up immediately, claiming that the bank needed the finalized digital scans before 12 noon to lock in the absolute best interest rate for our joint accounts. I stared at the glowing screen, my heart pounding a steady, furious rhythm against my ribs. It was a massive, fatal slip of the tongue. In his desperate anxiety to appease his mother and secure the bailout funds, Beckett had accidentally told the absolute truth. He had carelessly used the word bank and mentioned a strict midday deadline. He unknowingly confirmed in writing that a high-stakes corporate financial transaction was actively waiting on the timeline of our wedding day. It completely destroyed Celeste's lie about simple travel documents. I slowly looked up from the phone and met Celeste's expectant gaze. Every instinct inside me wanted to scream, to flip the glass vanity table, to shove the fraudulent papers directly into her chest. Instead, I channeled every ounce of professional discipline I had ever learned. I let my hands begin to tremble just slightly. I took a short, shallow breath, perfectly mimicking the overwhelming panic of an anxious bride. I looked at the notary, then back at Celeste, my eyes wide and pleading. I told her in a shaky, breathy voice that I was simply too nervous right now. I gestured frantically to my half-finished makeup, saying that my hands were shaking so terribly I would ruin the expensive mascara, and my signature would look completely illegible. I grabbed Celeste's hand, squeezing it with desperate, fake affection. I promised her, with absolute earnestness, that the very second we finished walking back down the aisle as husband and wife, we would go straight to a quiet room, and I would gladly sign every single page she needed. I begged her to let me keep my head clear just until the vows were spoken. Celeste studied my face intently. Her eyes narrowed for a microscopic fraction of a second, searching for any sign of deception. But my performance was flawless. I was playing the exact role they had cast me in. I was the fragile, compliant, overwhelmed woman. She offered a tight, patronizing smile and patted my cheek. She agreed, telling the notary to pack the bag and wait near the reception hall. She smoothly declared that we would handle the administrative duties immediately following the recession. The moment they exited the suite and the door clicked shut, my shaking hands instantly steadied. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a rapid series of messages from my allies. Tessa texted to confirm that the senior vice president of the lending institution had just been seated in the VIP section of the dining room. A second message arrived from Mallory, stating she had successfully bypassed the security check using her sponsor invitation and was currently positioned near the main stage. Finally, Della sent a single word confirming she was standing by. Ready to file the fraud injunction the moment I gave the signal, The trap was fully set. The board was completely locked. I stood up and allowed the bridal attendants to fasten the long row of silk buttons running down the back of my gown. I slipped my feet into my satin heels. I picked up my cascading bouquet of white orchids. Hidden securely inside the stiff floral wrapping, completely obscured by the thick green stems and white petals, was my mobile phone and the neatly folded copies of the true financial evidence Tessa had printed for me. I took one final, deep breath, filling my lungs with cold, absolute resolve. I turned the brass handle and stepped out into the grand hallway. The heavy double doors leading to the grand staircase were pulled open. The majestic swell of the string quartet echoed up the marble steps. Hundreds of faces turned upward, watching a supposedly innocent, radiant bride begin her long walk toward the altar. They saw a woman stepping into a fairy tale. Not a single soul in that venue knew I was marching straight down that aisle carrying the exact weapons required to completely annihilate the stage they had built to destroy me. The grand oak doors of the cathedral swung open with a heavy, resonant thud. The sudden rush of air caught the edges of my silk veil. The string quartet seamlessly transitioned into a sweeping, classical procession march. 200 guests rose to their feet in absolute unison. The rustle of expensive fabrics and muted gasps of admiration filled the massive, vaulted space. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in vibrant, fractured colors. I gripped the stems of my white orchid bouquet so tightly my knuckles ached, anchoring myself to the physical world. I began the long, slow walk down the white runner. At the far end of the aisle stood Beckett. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. As our eyes finally met across the sea of faces, I saw a profound, undeniable emotion welling up in his expression. His jaw trembled slightly. A single tear genuinely threatened to spill over his lashes. He looked exactly like a man completely overwhelmed by the profound beauty of the woman he loved. And that was the most agonizing realization of the entire day. The tragedy of Beckett Vale was never a lack of affection. It was a complete absence of courage. His tenderness was real, but it was absolutely useless because it would never, ever be strong enough to overcome his deep-rooted cowardice. He loved me, but he was still going to let his mother use my life to pay their toxic debts. I kept my chin held high. I measured my steps to the precise, steady rhythm of the music. My face remained a mask of flawless, radiant serenity. From the front pew, Celeste watched my approach. I caught a fleeting glimpse of her posture relaxing. She offered a soft, approving nod. My absolute calm convinced her that the psychological conditioning was holding perfectly. She looked at me and saw a beautiful, compliant asset walking obediently toward the dotted line. The officiant began the ceremony. I stood opposite the man who had secretly packaged my credit score into a commercial loan application. I did not scream. I did not throw my bouquet into the crowd. I stood perfectly still and allowed the elaborate theatrical performance to proceed exactly as they had scripted it. When it was time for the vows, Beckett took my hands in his. His palms were warm and slightly damp with nervous energy. He looked deeply into my eyes and spoke words that were poetically beautiful. He promised to harbor unwavering trust in our bond. He vowed to always share the heaviest burdens of life so that I would never have to carry them alone. He spoke passionately about building a secure, lasting future together on a foundation of absolute honesty. Listening to those vows was a surreal, almost out-of-body experience. To the hundreds of weeping guests sitting in the pews, his words sounded like the ultimate romantic devotion, but I possessed the encrypted translation key. When he said sharing the burdens, I knew he meant assuming equal liability for a $12 million bridge loan. When he spoke of a secure future, I knew he was referring to the immediate liquidity required to save his failing hospitality empire. The sheer cruelty of twisting the sacred language of love into a binding financial obligation made the air catch in my throat. Yet, I smiled gently. I spoke my own required responses softly and clearly. We exchanged the golden rings. The officiant pronounced us partners for life. The crowd erupted into thunderous, joyous applause. Following the ceremonial recessional, the entire congregation transitioned to the grand ballroom for the evening reception. The space was a breathtaking display of excessive wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over dozens of round tables draped in heavy ivory linen. Towering centerpieces of white roses dominated the room. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and expensive culinary creations. Just as Nora had predicted during our secret meeting in the dark hotel corridor, Celeste wasted absolutely no time. Before the plated dinner could even be served, and before the traditional first dance could begin, she smoothly orchestrated a shift in the evening schedule. She signaled the bandleader to lower the background music. She was moving to execute the family welcome toast. I glanced toward the front of the room, locating the primary guest table situated directly beside the dance floor. It was a masterfully curated collection of the very people the Vale family desperately needed to impress. Sitting there with a smug, expectant look was Adrian Loft. 2 seats down sat Edwin Crowley, the brilliant and completely unethical family attorney who had drafted my financial execution. Directly across from him was the senior vice president of the lending bank, nursing a glass of bourbon. The rest of the chairs were filled with major philanthropic donors and Celeste's most influential, wealthy socialite friends. They were the true audience for tonight. They were the people who needed to see the newly acquired collateral paraded around the room in a white dress. Celeste stood near the edge of the polished wooden dance floor, holding a wireless microphone. She beamed at the crowd, soaking in the collective attention. She raised her free hand to beckon Beckett and me forward. We walked toward her, but as we reached the edge of the stage, I felt Beckett suddenly stop dead in his tracks. His hand, which had been resting warmly against the small of my back, went completely rigid. I followed his terrified gaze toward the massive double doors at the very back of the ballroom. Standing there, partially obscured by the shadows of the arched entryway, was Nora. And standing shoulder to shoulder with his sister was Mallory Quinn. She wore a simple, elegant dark dress, blending in perfectly with the high society crowd. But her presence in that room was as subtle as a gunshot. She was the ghost of his past failures, the exact woman his family had systematically erased to protect their fragile narrative. The blood drained entirely from Beckett's face. His confident posture crumbled in an instant. Celeste, completely oblivious to the specter standing at the back of the room, turned to her son. She kept her brilliant maternal smile firmly fixed in place and offered the microphone to Beckett so he could begin the carefully rehearsed speech about family unity and new beginnings. Before his trembling fingers could even touch the metal handle, I stepped forward. I smoothly intercepted the microphone from Celeste's hand. I moved exactly 1 beat faster than they could process. I smiled brightly, projecting my voice clearly across the silent, waiting ballroom. I thanked everyone for sharing this beautiful evening with us. Then, I turned slightly toward the VIP table and announced that I also had a very small, special surprise prepared for the family. At the back of the room, Tessa saw my signal. She immediately tapped the shoulder of the lighting technician she had charmed earlier in the evening, in a matter of seconds. The grand crystal chandeliers dimmed to a soft glow. A massive, high-definition projector screen descended silently from the ceiling directly behind the stage area, illuminating the dark wall with a bright blue standby screen. Beckett spun around to face me, utter confusion and rising panic warring in his eyes. He looked down at my hands. He realized in that agonizing, frozen moment that I was not holding a handwritten card filled with sweet bridal thank you notes. I had reached into the thick folds of my silk gown and pulled out the heavy leather-bound portfolio. The gold-embossed crest of the Vale family caught the faint light from the stage. He recognized the trap he had helped set. The ballroom was completely silent. Every eye was locked on the stage. I gripped the microphone, looking directly out over the crowd, letting my gaze sweep past the confused faces of my own friends, past the horrifying realization dawning on Celeste, and finally settling firmly on the bank vice president sitting at the guest table. I held the portfolio up just slightly and spoke into the microphone with a calm, chilling clarity. If all the important people are present, then let us finish talking about what I was asked to sign right after the ceremony. The silence inside the grand ballroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a devastating storm. 200 guests sat completely frozen, their champagne glasses suspended in mid-air. I stood at the center of the stage, bathing in the harsh glare of the spotlight. I slowly flipped open the heavy leather cover of the portfolio. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I looked down at the pristine pages and began to read the title of the first document out loud. My voice echoed across the massive room, perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. I told the crowd that it was a spousal consent and personal guarantee. I explained, with the sterile precision of an analyst delivering a quarterly risk report, that immediately following our sacred wedding vows, a highly calculated plan was waiting to force me to become the sole financial guarantor for the massive, failing debts of the Vale family. Behind me, the towering projector screen flared to life. Tessa had perfectly timed the sequence. Massive, high-definition photographs of the legal documents materialized for every single guest to see. The first slide displayed the exact legal address of the small duplex in Ohio that my grandmother had left me. The next slide revealed the vicious notes written by their attorney, Edwin Crowley, detailing exactly how my clean credit history would secure their required refinancing. The final image magnified the yellow adhesive tabs, marking the exact lines where my forged future name was already typed, waiting to blindly assume tens of millions of dollars in toxic corporate liabilities. I looked directly at Beckett. He was standing completely paralyzed, his face drained of all color. I told the silent room that the man standing next to me did not ask me to marry him because he wanted to build a beautiful life together. He asked me to marry him because a wedding certificate was the final, mandatory requirement to close a desperate corporate bailout package. Every romantic promise he made at the altar was simply an aggressive negotiation tactic. A sudden movement at the back of the room broke the spell. Mallory Quinn stepped out from the shadows of the arched entryway and walked slowly down the center aisle. Whispers erupted from the tables of the wealthy socialites who recognized her. Mallory stopped halfway to the stage. She raised her chin and spoke with a clear, caring voice. She told the entire room that she had stood in my exact position a little over 1 year ago. She confirmed to every listening ear that she had been subjected to the exact same manipulation, the same candlelit dinners about sharing family burdens, and the same fraudulent paperwork pushed across a table on the eve of her wedding. The only difference, Mallory stated firmly, was that she had read the fine print early, and in retaliation, the Vale family had viciously destroyed her reputation to protect their own fabricated dignity. Before the crowd could even process the devastating testimony from Mallory, a sharp metallic click echoed through the ballroom speakers. Nora Vale was standing near the sound technician booth. She had plugged her mobile phone directly into the main audio board. She pressed play. The voice of Celeste Vale blasted through the pristine acoustic system. It was not the sweet, elegant tone she used to charm donors and guests. It was the cold, ruthless voice of a corporate dictator recorded months ago. The audio played clearly, with Celeste telling her son that he did not need a beautiful romance, but rather he needed to marry the exact type of woman who could keep their house standing. The immaculate, carefully constructed social facade of the Vale dynasty violently shattered in that exact second. Total chaos erupted at the primary guest table. The senior vice president of the lending bank slammed his linen napkin down, stood up immediately, and pulled out his phone to furiously dial his legal department. Several major philanthropic donors pushed their chairs back and began walking swiftly toward the exit. Adrian Loft and Edwin Crowley sat frozen in their seats, their faces pale with sheer panic. They knew their unethical game had just been completely exposed in front of the exact financial authorities they desperately needed to impress. Beckett finally broke his paralysis. He lunged forward, desperately grabbing my arm. His eyes were wide with terror and a pathetic, begging sorrow. He told me he was going to explain everything right after the ceremony. He stammered that he only wanted to save his family from complete ruin, and he swore with tears streaming down his face that he truly loved me. I pulled my arm out of his grasp with slow, deliberate disgust. The room fell silent again, waiting for my response. I looked deep into his crying eyes and delivered a sentence that dropped the temperature of the entire room to freezing. I told him that love is not a strategy to close a commercial loan file before 12 o'clock noon. Hearing those words, Celeste completely lost the last remaining thread of her famous composure. She stood up from her front row table, her face flushed with unhinged fury. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I simply did not understand what it meant to make a true sacrifice for family. She yelled that I was selfish and ungrateful. In her blind rage, she did not realize that she had just publicly confessed to everything. She had just confirmed to the entire horrified crowd that in her eyes, I was never meant to be a cherished daughter-in-law. I was nothing more than a financial solution. I reached down and slowly pulled the heavy diamond engagement ring off my left hand. The metal felt dirty against my skin. I placed the sparkling ring directly on top of the open leather portfolio resting on the podium. I looked over at the terrified wedding officiant standing near the edge of the stage and informed him that absolutely no marriage registration documents would be filed with the state today. I turned my back on the stage. I stepped down the short staircase and began walking straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. I did not run. I did not look down. I walked with my head held high, the heavy silk of my wedding gown trailing beautifully behind me. The crowd parted like the sea, giving me a wide berth, their faces reflecting a mixture of profound shock and undeniable respect. My biological mother, who had been sitting quietly in the second row, stood up and immediately linked her arm through mine. Tessa stepped out from the lighting booth to join my other side. As we reached the back doors, Mallory and Nora fell in step behind us. We walked out of the opulent venue together, stepping into the cool, humid night air of Savannah. Behind me, the grand ballroom was descending into absolute ruin. The Vale family was actively collapsing under the weight of their own exposed lies. Their carefully curated public image was dead. Their desperate financial transactions were completely obliterated. The fictional story of wealth and nobility they had sold to society was burning to the ground, and Beckett was left standing entirely alone in the harsh spotlight, completely surrounded by the wreckage he had actively chosen. But as I walked toward the waiting car, I did not feel an ounce of sorrow. I looked out into the darkness and felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of freedom. I was walking into a future where no one would ever be able to secretly place my signature onto the corner of a hidden page. I was walking into a life where no one would ever again dare to look me in the eye and call their cowardly betrayal a shared destiny. And as the engine started and we drove away from the estate, I smiled. It was the absolute coldest, most beautiful, and most perfect revenge I could have ever orchestrated. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please leave a comment down below and let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, I invite you to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us by hitting the hype button so that this story can be heard by many more people.